When I told my son Ethan that I was going to marry a woman from the Philippines, he didn't respond right away. He just sat there across from me at the kitchen table in my house in Sudbury, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd stopped drinking, and looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd just announced they were planning to drive from Ontario to Vancouver in January with bald tires. Not angry, not laughing, just that careful stillness, like he was deciding how to handle something fragile. He asked how long I'd known her. I told him about 14 months. He asked if we'd ever met in person. I said not yet. He set his mug down very slowly and said, "Dad, that's not how this works." I told him I understood why it sounded strange. He said it didn't sound strange. It sounded like something he'd read about a dozen times in the news. Then he pulled out his phone and started typing before I'd even finished my sentence. That moment stayed with me for a long time. Not because Ethan was wrong to be cautious. He's a careful person, always has been. What stayed with me was the realization that the man he was worried about, the lonely widower, the easy target, the one who couldn't see what was happening, he didn't recognize that as me. I didn't recognize it as me either. But somewhere between that kitchen table and the months that followed, I started to wonder if maybe neither of us knew the full picture. My wife Linda passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast, the way that kind always is. We'd been married 31 years and lived most of them in the same house in the Nadan neighborhood where I still live, the one with the blue siding that needs replacing, and the backyard I keep meaning to fence properly. After she was gone, I kept the house the way you do when you don't know what else to do. I went back to work because sitting still was worse. I retired 2 years later when my back gave out and the union pension kicked in, and then I just settled into the quiet. I started growing orchids, of all things. Linda had a few on the kitchen windowsill, and I didn't have the heart to let them die after she was gone. I kept them alive, then got curious, then joined a Facebook group for orchid growers because I was killing off one variety that refused to cooperate and needed advice. That group is where I first saw a message from Maricel. She wasn't asking me anything. She'd posted a question to the group about a dendrobium orchid her father had grown for 30 years before he passed. She'd inherited it and was terrified of losing it. The photo she posted showed the plant sitting in a clay pot with a handwritten label taped to the side. Her father's handwriting, she said in the post. She just wanted to know if she was watering it right. I answered because I'd made the same mistake with the same variety 2 months earlier and killed it, and I figured that was useful information. She replied to thank me. I asked if it had recovered. She said yes and sent a photo. That could have been the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. We talked about orchids for maybe 2 weeks, then about our gardens, then about the places we lived, then about our families. She was a nurse in Iloilo City, a place I'd never heard of and had to look up on a map. She had a younger brother in Cebu and her mother living with her. She'd been widowed herself 4 years before, a fact she mentioned the same way I mentioned Linda, plainly, without making it the whole point of the sentence. I'm not going to pretend it turned romantic quickly, because it didn't. It was just a conversation. Every few days at first, then every day, then every evening. My friend Doug caught me on my phone one afternoon when he came by to help me stack firewood, and he asked who I was messaging. I said someone from an orchid group. He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't speak, shrugged, and went back to the wood. I don't know when I started looking forward to the conversations the way I did. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like one day I noticed that when something interesting happened, a cardinal showing up at the feeder, the leaves losing in a particularly aggravating way, my neighbor's dog getting loose again and eating half my front garden, my first thought was that I wanted to tell Maricel. That surprised me more than I was expecting. We talked about everything and nothing. She told me about the brownouts in Iloilo, when the power would go out for hours, and she'd sit on her front step in the dark, waiting for the generator at the hospital to kick in. I told her about Sudbury winters, which she found genuinely difficult to comprehend. She sent me a video of herself wearing a sweater and mittens because the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Celsius. I had to explain to her that 18 degrees was considered t-shirt weather where I lived in October. She did not believe me. There were nights when I'd finish a call and sit in the living room for a while after, not doing anything, just sitting, and it occurred to me that I hadn't felt that particular kind of quiet contentment in a long time. Not loneliness, not grief, just the ordinary satisfaction of having talked to someone who actually listened. None of that made what came next any easier. When I told Ethan I was thinking seriously about going to the Philippines to meet Maricel, he didn't yell. He's not the kind of person who yells. Instead, he sent me a link, then another one, then a third. Articles about romance scams targeting widowers. A YouTube video of a man describing how he'd lost his retirement savings. A Reddit thread full of stories that all started with, "I met her online." He called me the next morning and walked me through each one carefully. He said he wasn't trying to hurt me, he just needed me to understand what was out there. He said he'd been doing some reading, and there were people, organized groups, even, who specifically looked for men my age in grief support forums and hobby groups because those men were lonely and easier to trust. I told him this wasn't like that. He said he knew I believed that, but that was part of it, that's how it worked. They were good at making you believe it. He wasn't cruel about any of it. That's the part that made it hard. If he'd been dismissive, I could have pushed back easier, but he was worried. Genuinely, visibly worried about his father. And that got under my skin in a way the articles alone never would have. I didn't sleep well for about 2 weeks after that conversation. I started looking at Maricel's Facebook page differently, analyzing things, looking for inconsistencies. I felt terrible doing it. I'd be mid-conversation with her, talking about her mother's blood pressure medication, or the flooding in one of the barangays near her hospital, and in the back of my mind I'd be making a checklist. Has she asked for money? No. Has she talked about a sick relative who needs an operation? No. Has she ever steered the conversation toward my finances? No. She knew I had a pension. That was it. She'd never asked how much, never asked about the house, never said anything that resembled a setup. But Ethan had planted a specific question in my head that I couldn't shake. Why me? Out of everyone she could talk to, why a 62-year-old retired electrician from Sudbury, Ontario, who posted in an orchid Facebook group? I almost didn't bring it up with her. I went back and forth on it for 2 weeks. Every time we talked I'd think, tonight I'll say something. Then she'd mentioned that her patient had asked her to pray with him before surgery, or she'd send me a photo of her mother's garden, and I couldn't bring myself to turn the conversation into a courtroom. Eventually I did, because carrying it alone was making me worse company than she deserved. I told her about the articles Ethan had sent. I told her about the sleepless nights. I told her that I didn't believe she was lying to me, but that I couldn't honestly tell her none of it had gotten into my head, because that would itself be a lie. I talked too long and said too little, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd just accused someone of stealing from me, and then told them I was pretty sure they hadn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Is Ethan a good son?" I said yes without hesitating. She said, "Then he's doing exactly what a good son should do." That wasn't what I'd expected. I'd expected either hurt feelings or reassurances. I didn't expect her to take his side. She said she understood why those stories existed. She said there were people in the Philippines who did exactly what Ethan was afraid of, and that pretending otherwise wouldn't help either of us. She said she couldn't prove anything to me from a phone screen, and she wasn't going to try. Then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "The only thing I can ask is that you don't decide what you know before you've seen anything." That was it. No wounded silence. Just that. I booked my flight to Manila 3 days later, connection through Toronto, overnight to Ninoy Aquino, then a smaller plane down to Iloilo. I was on the road to the airport at 4 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, my neighbor's dog barking at my headlights as I backed out of the driveway. I hadn't told many people I was going. Doug knew. My daughter knew and had offered to drive me. I told her I'd rather go alone, which was true, but also I didn't want to spend an hour in a car with someone who was trying to figure out how to say the right things. The flight was fine. I'm not a nervous flyer. I slept most of the Manila leg. What I didn't do was sleep the night before, lying in bed in the house that still had Linda's curtains in the bedroom, and my youngest granddaughter's crayon drawing of a dog taped to the fridge. I kept thinking about what I'd say when I walked through the arrival's door. I'd planned something light, casual, something that wouldn't make it weird immediately. Maricel was shorter than I'd expected. That was my first thought, which is a ridiculous first thought to have after 14 months of talking to someone. She was standing slightly off to the side of the crowd in a yellow shirt, and she was looking at the wrong set of doors, so I saw her for a few seconds before she saw me. She looked exactly like her photographs, which somehow I'd still been worried about. When she turned and found me, she smiled. Not the big performed smile you see in photographs. The smaller one, the slightly disbelieving one, the one that happens when something you'd half convinced yourself wasn't real, turns out to be standing right in front of you. She said, "You're taller than I thought." I said that was a first. She said she'd been picturing me as shorter because the Orchid group profile photo only showed my face. Then she looked at my jacket, a lined flannel thing I'd packed because I genuinely couldn't mentally prepare for 30-degree heat in November, and said I was going to be miserable inside of 10 minutes. She was correct. We spent 8 days together. I'll try to describe what those 8 days were actually like rather than what they felt like in the abstract, because the abstract version doesn't tell you much. She worked 3 of those days, so I'd spend mornings at the small apartment she rented near the hospital. Her mother occupied the back bedroom and treated me with a formality that was both slightly terrifying and genuinely touching. I'd have coffee with her in the kitchen while Maricel was at work, and her mother would practice her English on me, and I would try to learn Hiligaynon phrases from a notebook I'd brought, which made her laugh every time. On the days Maricel wasn't working, we went to La Paz Market in the morning, where she knew every vendor by name and where I spent most of my time trying not to walk into anything. We went to the malls when the afternoon heat was too heavy to be outside. We sat on plastic chairs at a small restaurant near the waterfront and ate pancit and grilled pork and something called bak choy, which is a noodle soup that I still think about more often than I should. I was watching everything. Not because I was suspicious anymore exactly, more because I'd promised myself I'd pay attention, and I wanted to keep that promise. What I noticed wasn't dramatic. It was small things. The way she spoke to the woman running the rice stall at the market, not like a customer, like a person who mattered. The way she pulled her mother's chair out at dinner without thinking about it. The way she didn't lose her patience once when the taxi driver took the wrong route and we were 40 minutes late to meet her cousin. The way she apologized to the driver when we finally arrived, not to us. There was one afternoon at the hospital when I went to meet her after her shift ended. She hadn't finished yet, so I waited in the corridor outside her ward. Through the small window in the door, I could see her at the end of a bed, talking to a man in his 70s whose family had been there all day. I don't know what she was saying. Whatever it was, she was saying it while holding his hand, and he was listening to her the way people listen when they're scared, and someone is telling them they don't have to be. She didn't know I could see her. Nobody had asked her to do that. Her shift was technically over. I turned away from the window because I didn't want her to come out and catch me watching something that had nothing to do with me. But I thought about it on the jeepney ride back to her neighborhood that evening. I thought about it a lot. The morning I flew home was a Tuesday. She drove me to the airport in her cousin's car, and we said goodbye in the departure lane because parking was impossible and there was no point in both of us going in. She didn't cry. I didn't either, which surprised me. We just stood there for a minute while other travelers wheeled their bags past us, and then she hugged me and said to text her when I landed in Manila. I said I would. She said to water the orchids when I got home, not too much. I laughed. I got on the plane. The drive back from the airport in Toronto was about 4.5 hours. I'd left my truck in long-term parking and I drove most of it in the dark, through stretches of the 400 where there was nothing but highway and pines and the occasional transport going the other way. By the time I got back to Sudbury, it was after 2 in the morning. I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going in. The house looked exactly the same. The blue siding still needed replacing. The neighbor's dog was quiet for once. Inside, everything was where I'd left it. The coffee maker on the counter. The hook by the door where I'd hung my keys for 30 years. Linda's curtains catching the streetlight the way they always had. Something had shifted. I couldn't have told you what, exactly. Nothing in the house had changed. But I had, a little, and a house doesn't always adjust for that. Ethan came up from Ottawa to visit about 3 weeks later. We sat in the kitchen, same table as before, and he asked how it went. I told him it went fine. He waited, which is something he does when he knows there's more. I told him about the market and the batchoy and the taxi driver who went the wrong way. I told him about the mornings with Maricel's mother practicing her English. I told him about what I'd seen through the window at the hospital. I told him that she had never once, in 8 days, made me feel like a transaction. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What's she actually like?" Not when is she coming here? Not so what's the plan? What's she actually like? It was the right question, and I think he knew it was. I told him she was practical and a little stubborn and funnier than you'd expect, and that she took her mother's health personally in the way that nurses sometimes do with the people they love. I told him she was not the person he'd been afraid she was. I told him I was not the person those articles were about. He nodded. He said, "Okay, Dad." That was enough. What I didn't tell him that afternoon was that I'd already started quietly doing the math. My CPP and OAS together were enough to live on in Canada, but just. In Iloilo, they were more than enough, comfortably more than enough. The house in Sudbury had gone up considerably since we bought it. The winters weren't getting easier on my joints. And the truth underneath all the practical calculations was simpler than any of them. I was tired of the quiet that the house had settled into, and I wasn't tired of her. I listed the house the following spring. Ethan helped me sort through what to keep and what to let go, which took most of a weekend and was harder than I'd expected. I kept Linda's wedding ring and her mother's china and the orchids. Everything else found its way to family, or to the Habitat for Humanity Restore on La Salle. The morning I handed over my keys to the new owners was a Friday in June. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away for about 20 minutes, drinking a coffee I didn't particularly want, watching a sparrow work over the crumbs around the patio chairs. I wasn't sad. I wasn't certain either. I was just aware that I'd made a decision, and that being aware of a decision is different from knowing how it will unfold. What life in Iloilo actually looked like in the first few months was not what I'd imagined, and I'd been careful not to imagine too much. The heat was relentless in a way that visits hadn't prepared me for. Not just the temperature, but the humidity that made every afternoon feel physical, like walking through something. The brownouts happened more often than I'd expected and lasted longer. My Hiligaynon was still embarrassing. I got lost on the jeepney routes more times than I'll admit. There were days when something small would go sideways. A bill paid to the wrong office. A permit that required 3 additional documents nobody had mentioned. An appointment that got pushed back twice without explanation. and I'd feel a tightness in my chest that was purely Canadian. The particular frustration of a person raised to believe that a schedule is a contract. Maricel would look over at me during those moments, not impatiently, and say something like, "It'll sort itself out," which was usually true, and which didn't always help. But we sorted it out together, which was different from sorting things out alone, and that difference mattered more than I'd realized it would. Ethan visited in February, partly to escape the Ottawa winter, partly, I think, to see for himself. He stayed 2 weeks. Maricel's mother made him chicken adobo the first night, and he spent the rest of the trip asking when it was being made again. He met her cousins and her colleagues from the hospital and a collection of neighborhood kids who wanted to practice their English on the only other person around who spoke it natively. His last night there, we sat outside after dinner, while Maricel and her mother did dishes inside and talked over each other the way they always do. Ethan looked out at the street, the neighbor's rooster already settled for the evening, someone 2 houses over playing guitar badly, and he said, "She takes care of you." I said she did. He said, "I don't mean like a nurse. I mean she actually takes care of you." I told him I knew what he meant. He didn't apologize for the articles. I didn't need him to. He'd been looking out for his father the only way he knew how, with the information he had, and there's nothing in that worth apologizing for. What he'd been missing was the thing you can't get from articles: the specific unperformable reality of one particular person in one particular life. You can read everything ever written about what can go wrong and still not know what went right, because what went right doesn't make headlines. People still ask me sometimes whether I think I got lucky. Usually it's someone who's heard part of the story and is trying to figure out whether to be hopeful or cautious about something similar in their own life. I don't think luck is quite the right word. Luck implies you didn't do anything to deserve the outcome. I paid attention. I watched how she treated people who couldn't do anything for her. I listened to what she didn't say as much as what she did. I asked hard questions and sat with uncomfortable answers. I was honest with her even when honesty was embarrassing. That's not luck. That's just doing the work. Ethan flew back to Ottawa on a Sunday. I drove him to the airport and we sat in the car for a few minutes before he went in. He's not a hugger, never has been, but he put his hand on my arm before he got out and said he was glad I was happy. I told him I was. He said to send photos when the orchids bloomed. I told him I would. There's a small covered terrace off the side of the apartment where I keep the orchids now, more of them than I started with, because Maricel's mother started propagating them without telling me, and now there are 17 pots lined up along the railing, which is not exactly what I'd planned, but is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you share a life with people, instead of just living alongside them. Some mornings, I sit out there with my coffee before the heat gets serious, and there are birds I still don't know the names of moving through the tree at the property line, and the street below is already going about its business: the bread cart, the school children in uniforms, someone's television loud through an open window. Maricel comes out eventually, still in her nursing scrubs if she has an early shift, with her own coffee, and she sits in the other chair and we don't always say much. I spent a long time in my life thinking that contentment was something you earned after enough hard work, enough years, enough things crossed off the list. What I understand now is that it's simpler than that and also harder. It doesn't come from accumulating the right things. It comes from not turning away from the right person, because other people are afraid of what they can't see. Ethan wasn't wrong to worry. He just didn't know her yet. Now he does. That's the only part of the story that ended up being simple.